Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the chance to speak with you a bit this afternoon. If for whatever reason you can't hear me, just let me know. It sounds okay from up here, but I know it sometimes sounds different in the past or in the back. So what I'm going to talk about today is what's often referred to as great power competition or great power rivalry. The United States finds itself in a moment of rivalry, of competition, and potential conflict in its relations with both China and Russia. And I think that the best way to address this is by looking back at the past of American foreign policy, and particularly by looking at the Cold War. That's what I did in a book that I published earlier this year called The Twilight Struggle, and that metaphor is actually a good place to start. And so people of a certain age may sort of remember where the Twilight Struggle metaphor came from. John F. Kennedy used it in a speech he gave in 1961 to describe the U.S.-Soviet Cold War. And basically what he was referring to was that the Cold War was not a state of war in the sense that Americans had experienced it during World War II, but it wasn't a state of peace as Americans understood that term either. Just as twilight is neither night nor day, neither dark nor light, the Cold War was neither war nor peace. And so there had never been a time in American history, a period of peace in which the United States had maintained alliances with countries around the world. There had never been a previous period in American history outside of major wars where the United States had deployed its military forces around the globe on a semi-permanent basis. There had never been a time of peace in American history where the United States had developed what we might think of as the national security state, a very big, active federal government that could have a standing military, a standing intelligence establishment, and things of that sort. And so the Cold War might not have been a hot war, even though the danger of hot war was there, and even though there were hot wars during the Cold War in Korea and Vietnam and other places, but it certainly wasn't peace either. And the reason that analogy or that metaphor is appropriate is that we live in a somewhat similar situation today. I think that the reality of the matter is that the United States is facing new twilight struggles with both Russia and China, two countries that are very much seeking to change the world in which we live. And so if you look at Chinese foreign policy over the past 20 years, under Xi Jinping in particular, it's quite clear that China seeks to become the primary power in Asia and perhaps eventually in the world. It would like to have a sphere of influence in its region similar to what the United States accomplished in the Western Hemisphere during the late 19th century. It would like to physically dominate Taiwan and the South China Sea and the East China Sea and other areas around its frontiers. It would like to create a world that increasingly revolves around Beijing economically and technologically in the 21st century in the way that the world revolved around the United States in the 20th century. And it sees the United States as the primary barrier to many of these ambitions. If you look at Russia, Russia is obviously weaker than China. We're seeing some of the limitations of its power exposed in Ukraine today. I don't think that we're going to wake up in a world that is run by Moscow 20 years from now. But Russia is trying to pretty significantly destabilize the existing international order today. Its war in Ukraine is meant to violently recreate a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. It's seeking to weaken the influence of NATO and the European Union. It's trying to chip away at the European order that emerged with the end of the Cold War and the international system that emerged after World War II. And it sees the United States as a barrier to those ambitions as well. Now, in both cases, fortunately, these competitions, these rivalries are occurring mostly below the threshold of outright war. And so when we think of Russia and its policy vis-a-vis the United States, we think of cyber attacks, we think of political meddling and that sort of thing. When we think about China, maybe we think about the technological rivalry between the US and China, about semiconductors, about creeping maritime expansion in the South China Sea. But both of these competitions are being carried out in the shadow of war. Both Russia and China have undertaken major military buildups over the past couple of decades, if not more, meant to give them a greater degree of strategic advantage in their relationship with the United States and its allies. And in both cases, the prospect of a no-kidding shooting war is unfortunately increasing. And so we saw this with China last August in the crisis that erupted after then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, where China carried out its most extensive show of force in the Taiwan Strait in over a quarter century, which was really meant to demonstrate the abilities that China has developed to blockade, perhaps even assault Taiwan at some point in the future. If you look at Eastern Europe, there's obviously a hot war, a very hot war raging in Ukraine right now, with all the danger of escalation into a US-Russia conflict that potentially brings. And unfortunately, leaders in China and Russia are not really talking like they want peace right now. And so about a year ago, Xi Jinping chose to mark the 100th birthday celebration of the Chinese Communist Party by warning that anybody who got in China's way as it ascends to global superiority will have their heads bashed bloody against a great wall of steel. Russian officials have said that they seek a transition to a post-Western world. Putin often says that Russia is already engaged in conflict with the West. And so the bad news is that there is a rough period of international relations ahead of us. I think in the best case, the United States is looking at something like new Cold Wars with Russia and China. In the worst case, which we all certainly hope to avoid, there's a real danger of hot war. So that's the bad news. The good news is that this isn't as new or as original as it seems. We often talk about the return of great power competition. We talk about it as though it's something new, but that's really only because it's actually quite old. What we're seeing today is very normal. And so protracted, dangerous rivalries between the major powers are as old as history itself. You could see it in the competition between Athens and Sparta in the ancient Greek world in the 5th century BC. You could see it in the Great Game between Russia and England in the 19th century. You could see it in the Anglo-German rivalry of the period preceding World War I. And of course, you could see it in the US-Soviet rivalry during the Cold War. Some of these competitions went hot, some of them stayed cold. I think all of them, particularly the US-Soviet Cold War, have something to teach us about the problems that the United States confronts today and how it can deal with them. Now, in making this argument, I want to address the obvious objection up front, which is that the situation the United States faces today is not entirely like, perhaps not even like in a majority sense, the situation that it confronted in the Cold War vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And I think that's true enough in many ways. The geography of the US-China conflict, for instance, is much different than the geography of the US-Soviet Cold War. The center of gravity of the Cold War was in Central Europe for the most part. The center of gravity in the US-China competition will be in maritime Asia. The players are different. Xi Jinping is not Mao Zedong. Vladimir Putin is not Joseph Stalin, although in both cases I think the resemblance grows stronger every day. The setting is different. Now we often talk about an international order, an international system that's under strain. In the wake of World War II, one of the reasons the Soviet Union posed such a problem for the United States was that there was no international system. Large parts of the world were just convulsed by chaos in the wake of that terrible war. The world is more interdependent, I should say, economically and technologically, particularly vis-a-vis China, than it ever was with the Soviet Union. And so we certainly shouldn't think that we can just kind of run the same playbook from the Cold War and succeed. But with all that said, I think there are at least 3 good reasons why it makes sense to study the Cold War and trying to understand the situation today. The first is that the Cold War itself just wasn't that unique. There were aspects of it that were unique, that were unprecedented. There had never been a great power rivalry carried out in the shadow of nuclear weapons before, for instance. But in many ways, it was just one manifestation of this larger phenomenon of rivalry and competition between the great powers. As I mentioned, that phenomenon goes back as far as history. If Thucydides had come back to life in the 1970s, he would have understood quite well what was going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so looking at this previous epic example of great power rivalry can teach us something about that phenomenon and what it takes to succeed in it. The second reason is that there's just not an inexhaustible list of cases in our own American history that the United States can look to in trying to draw lessons about great power competition from the past. Depending on how you count, there are either 1 or 2 examples in American history of protracted competitions against authoritarian powers that lasted decades. The Cold War is also the only one of these that actually occurred within the living memory of many people who are still alive today, and certainly within the living memory of many of our own policymakers. I can guarantee you that Joe Biden has some understanding of what happened during the Cold War, and he will draw lessons, for better or worse, from it. And so I would prefer that we draw these lessons systematically as possible. And then the third reason is that while the Cold War is not a perfect analog for the situation the U.S. faces today, it's not a terrible one either. The Cold War was a struggle to shape the terms of international order. It was a struggle that blended geopolitics and ideology. It was about trying to shape the balance of ideas as well as the balance of power. And most importantly, it involved solving a number of problems: how to forge a long-term strategy that can survive even amid shocks and crises, how to manage alliances spanning much of the globe, how to blend competition and negotiation. All of these are challenges that American policymakers faced during the Cold War, and they're all challenges that American policymakers will face again today. And in fact, I would say that the whole point of studying history is that we can learn lessons from a past that never precisely resembles the present that we inhabit. I think Cold War policymakers understood this quite well. And so in 1947, George Marshall, who had been the organizer of victory during World War II and was then the American Secretary of State during the early Cold War, gave an address at Princeton University. And he basically said that he didn't think that anyone could understand what was happening between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1947 if they hadn't studied the history of the Peloponnesian War. Dean Acheson, who succeeded George Marshall as Secretary of State and was around for some of the most important achievements of the late 1940s and early 1950s, liked to talk about the examples of Rome and Carthage to illustrate what it was like to operate in a world dominated by two rival powers. There was an understanding that while the past was never exactly like the present, you needed a historical sensibility, an understanding of what had come before if you were to thrive in current affairs. And I think that the United States needs a similar sensibility today. And so with all of that as preface, let me spend about 20 minutes just talking through what I see as some of the key lessons of the Cold War for U.S. statecraft in the present. And I'm going to run off a handful of these things, and I intend them mostly as provocations and prompts for discussion, and I'm happy to address any of these issues or other things that people would like to discuss further in our question and answer session. The first lesson that I think we should take from the Cold War is the importance of having a theory of victory, and the importance of knowing what the United States is trying to achieve and how it plans to do so. And I think this is a good place to introduce George Kennan and to talk a little bit about the role that he played in American strategy during the Cold War. Kennan was America's foremost Sovietologist in the late 1940s. He'd spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union. He was working at the embassy in Moscow as the deputy chief of mission there when he wrote one of the most famous documents in the history of U.S. foreign policy, the so-called Long Telegram, trying to explain Soviet behavior to policymakers in Washington. He would then go on to become one of America's most important grand strategists in the Cold War when he ran the policy planning staff at the State Department. And he wrote two documents in the late 1940s, the Long Telegram, which I just mentioned, another document called the X article, which was sort of a public version of the Long Telegram published in Foreign Affairs, that we still look back on as foundational state papers of this period. But the reason that we view those papers as so foundational is not because they contain detailed policy prescriptions. If you read the Long Telegram, if you read the X article, Kennan doesn't have much to say about how the United States should address the economic crisis in Europe or the crisis involving the Soviet Union and Iran or any other particular policy issue. They're really significant for the diagnosis of the problem they offer. And Kennan's essential argument was that there could be no appeasement, there could be no long-term coexistence with the Soviet Union because the combination of Russian history, that traditional Russian insecurity, communist ideology, and then Stalin's own paranoia made it impossible to ease the fears that drove Soviet policy. But he also argued that the Soviet Union was fundamentally a cautious power. It was not in a hurry to achieve the overthrow of the capitalist world, even though that was the goal that communist ideology prescribed over the long term. And he argued that Soviet officials understood that the Soviet Union was weaker than the United States. And so this led Kennan to a very high-level prescription for how the United States should handle itself in the Cold War. He said, if the United States can simply contain Soviet influence short of war, if it can hold the line in key places, if it can push back, if it can increase the strains on the Soviet Union, it will disprove the communist thesis that the capitalist world is destined to fall apart over the long term. It will add to the strains within the Soviet system, and over the long term it will lead to the breakup or mellowing of Soviet power. Kennan was basically offering a theory of the case, sort of a sense of what destination the United States should work toward, the breakup or mellowing of Soviet power, and how, in a very broad sense, it could get there. That was his contribution, and it was a fundamentally important one. If you look at our situation today, I think we're still lacking the sort of clarity that some of Kennan's writings offered. And so you'll often hear it said that the United States is in a state of competition with China. Both of our last two presidents have made that argument. But competition isn't really a strategy. It's just kind of a fact of geopolitical life. It's a description of the international environment. We haven't really answered the question of what we seek to achieve vis-a-vis China. Are we trying to build up leverage so we can strike some grand bargain that will resolve the issues that divide the United States and China? Are we trying to actively roll back Chinese power? Are we simply trying to hold the line as the United States did during the Cold War? These are difficult questions, and it's understandable why the United States has hesitated to answer them. But I think it's dangerous not to, because we're ultimately going to need to know the destination of the geopolitical journey on which the country is embarking today. So that's one lesson. A second lesson would be that the balance of military power shapes risk-taking and decision-making. And so during the Cold War, there were big debates within government, within academia, over whether the military balance, and particularly the nuclear balance, mattered or not. Whether you could get more leverage, whether you could do better in international crises if you had more weapons, more nuclear weapons than the other side, or whether it was all just kind of useless beyond a certain level of potential destruction. There was a very famous political scientist, a man named Robert Jervis, who died last year, who sort of made a name for himself in the late 1970s by authoring an article called Why the Strategic Balance Doesn't Matter, or Why Nuclear Superiority Doesn't Matter, rather. But with respect to Professor Jervis, I would suggest that he was wrong. The strategic balance actually mattered quite a lot, because it shaped perceptions of advantage in the military realm, and that perception of military advantage played a crucial role in decision-making in key moments. And so let me give you a couple examples of this. During the late 1940s, when the United States had a monopoly on atomic weapons, it was the sense of security that monopoly gave American policymakers that encouraged them to do things like the Marshall Plan for Europe, creating the North Atlantic Treaty, later the North Atlantic Treaty Organization with Europe, and basically taking a fairly forward-leaning stance during the Cold War. It wasn't that American policymakers wanted to wage war against the Soviet Union, but it was understanding that the United States held a trump card in that respect that gave them the freedom of action they needed to take measures meant to win the Cold War peacefully. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, in a series of crises over geopolitical hotspots like West Berlin and Cuba, it was the understanding that the United States had an advantage in strategic nuclear weapons in particular that gave presidents like Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy the confidence to negotiate from a position of strength in those crises. If you look at the 1980s, at the end of the Cold War, we now can see that President Reagan used a major buildup of American military power in both conventional and nuclear weapons as a way of generating the geopolitical leverage that was necessary to negotiate better arms control deals with the Soviet Union and ultimately reduce the level of nuclear weapons. It was very much a build-up to build-down approach. In none of these cases was it the truth that American policymakers were eager for war, for confrontation with the Soviet Union. But knowing who was likely to win that war, if it somehow broke out, was important to shaping the amount of risk and the type of decisions that American leaders were willing to take in peacetime competition. This is an important thing to keep in mind today as well. If you look at, say, the US-China competition, the balance of military power in the Western Pacific is going to shape the decisions that US and Chinese leaders make in crises over Taiwan, for instance. And the problem for the United States is that the military balance in that part of the world has been eroding quite dramatically for about 25 years. In the late 1990s, the last time there was a major crisis over Taiwan, there wasn't much question about who would win a war if it broke out. The United States would clearly win, and without breaking much of a sweat. That's not the case today. Depending on who you ask, it's now viewed as more or less kind of a coin flip who might win a war over Taiwan if it were to break out. And the military balance is only going to get worse for the United States over the next few years. The United States has another problem as well, which is that it has more rivals, more problems in the world than it does military power to go around. And this has been dramatized by the events of the last year, when the United States faced a crisis in the Taiwan Strait at exactly the same time it had a war underway in Ukraine. There are things the United States can do to solve these problems without bankrupting ourselves. I don't think this is an insoluble challenge. The point I would simply make, though, is that if the United States allows itself to fall into a position of military weakness in areas of geopolitical tension, it will eventually pay a price for it. And that's a second lesson. A third lesson that we should keep in mind is that winning a twilight struggle requires treating negotiation as a tool of competition, not as a replacement for it. And so while we think of the Cold War as a standoff between the great powers, there were negotiations, or at least diplomatic contacts underway between US and Soviet leaders for most of the Cold War. Every American president of the Cold War era met his Soviet counterpart at the summit at least once. More often than not, negotiations were underway on arms control or other issues. At various points, the United States and the Soviet Union even managed to sign agreements on the limitation of nuclear weapons, on global public health issues, on a variety of other things. And this is because American leaders understood that diplomacy was actually a way of promoting American objectives in the context of the Cold War. Talking to the enemy, arms control, this wasn't just kind of silly peacenik stuff. These were actually important tools of competition in their own right. Because they could help the United States achieve a variety of different things. One thing they could do was to help reduce the danger of war at the margins. And one example of this is an agreement that was never actually written down on paper. It was just an implicit deal between the United States and the Soviet Union. And during the 1960s and early 1970s, Washington and Moscow came to an implicit agreement that they would not shoot down each other's space reconnaissance satellites. Both sides had the ability to do so. We could shoot down Soviet reconnaissance satellites when they came overhead. The Soviets could do the same thing. But we agreed not to because both sides understood that it was actually dangerous for the other side not to have any idea what you were doing. Because if the other side had no information on what you were planning militarily, they might worry that you were getting ready to launch a surprise attack and think that they had to go first instead. This is what Thomas Schelling, a great political scientist, referred to as the mutual fear of surprise attack. And so both sides recognized that a little bit of military transparency was actually in their own interest, and they forged an agreement meant to bring this about. Negotiation could also be useful as a way of isolating areas of cooperation, areas where the United States and the Soviet Union actually had converging interests, even though they disagreed on nearly everything else. In the 1960s, the two superpowers reached agreement on one of the most effective multilateral agreements of all time. This would be the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has played an important role in keeping the number of nuclear weapons states relatively small over the last 50 years. And they did so because they recognized that both countries had an interest in avoiding nuclear anarchy, a situation where 30, 40, 50 countries had nuclear weapons, even though they were ideological and geopolitical enemies. U.S. officials even understood that negotiation could be a way of kind of giving the United States a strategic breather at times when it was tired and needed to rest. And so one of the reasons that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger decided to pursue détente with the Soviet Union in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which involved a variety of negotiations on arms control, trade, and other issues, was that they realized the United States just wasn't in a position in the wake of the Vietnam War to engage in all-out competition. It needed a little bit of a breather before it could run at full speed again. And so negotiation played an important competitive role there as well. We should keep all these things in mind today when we think about the role of negotiations in our competitions with Moscow and Beijing. It would be a mistake, of course, to assume that simply talking to the other side can allow us to transcend the tensions between the US and Russia or the US and China. I think it's a mistake to assume that if America and China, for instance, manage to cooperate on climate change, that cooperation will spill over into other areas. I don't think that's how it's going to work. And I think it would be a mistake to make concessions on geopolitical issues like Ukraine or Taiwan or whatever the case may be in order to secure Chinese or Russian cooperation on other issues. We also have to keep in mind that the current governments in both Russia and China have a long history of solemnly signing international agreements and then cheating on them. And so it's important to keep all of this in mind. What we should do, though, is patiently explore areas of cooperation. We should think about areas where unconstrained competition isn't actually in our interests. That could be in the realm of nuclear weapons. It could be in the realm of advanced technologies and like artificial intelligence. We should use diplomacy as a way of inserting pauses in the competition when it's useful to us to do so. And basically, we should think about diplomacy as a way of making these competitions with Russia and China safe enough that the United States will stick with them long enough to prevail in them over time. That's a third lesson. A fourth lesson is that winning bilaterally requires competing multilaterally. Or another way of putting this is that the best outside game is a good inside game. During the Cold War, the most effective tool of American policy wasn't something that the United States did to the Soviet Union. It was something that it did with its friends. And this was to create a thriving, mostly democratic, free world that was strong enough that it could not be intimidated or outperformed by the communist world. The United States created a global network of alliances binding itself to countries in East Asia and Europe. It rehabilitated defeated enemies from World War II, Japan and West Germany, most notably. It took up the leadership of an international economy that promoted prosperity on a wider scale than humanity had ever seen before. Basically, it helped build a community that was strong enough that it was likely to prevail in the Cold War in the end. Doing so, by the way, was not easy. It wasn't easy if you looked at the history of the 20th century up until 1945, where what we might call the capitalist powers had repeatedly torn themselves apart in global wars. And it wasn't easy in the sense that dealing with U.S. allies was sometimes only a little bit easier than dealing with U.S. enemies. Alliance relations could be a pretty bare-knuckled affair during the Cold War. In 1966, of course, France, led by Charles de Gaulle, withdrew from NATO's military command and told Lyndon Johnson that the United States had to withdraw every one of its soldiers from French territory for France to regain its sovereignty. That led Johnson's Secretary of State to ask de Gaulle whether that included the Americans who were buried in military cemeteries in Normandy and elsewhere. We now know that the United States could take a pretty cold approach to alliance relations as well. One of the things that's emerged in recent years is that had the Soviets managed to overrun Western Europe, the United States actually would have launched nuclear weapons against its own allies to prevent the Soviets from harnessing their industrial and military capabilities to their own. But by and large, we managed to hold these alliances together. We managed to keep in mind the old aphorism that fighting with allies is better than fighting without them, because we understood that being generous to our allies, that working hard to consolidate these relationships would pay off in the end. It would develop a stronger geopolitical position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union than the United States could ever hope to do on its own. Today, the same thing holds true. Allies are America's asymmetric edge in global affairs. They're our secret sauce in foreign policy. If you add up the United States and just its treaty allies in Europe and in the Asia Pacific, they dwarf Russia and China put together in terms of shares of global GDP, in terms of shares of global military spending, in terms of diplomatic influence, in terms of soft power, in terms of basically any other index of international power you can think of. As long as the United States holds together with its allies, as long as it continues to invest in these relationships and help adapt them so that they are well suited to the challenges presented by the authoritarian powers, the United States is likely to fare just fine in the end. That's not going to be easy. It's not always a matter of just being nice to the allies, but it is absolutely critical to success in these competitions as well. The fifth lesson I'd offer is that you can't win a twilight struggle on the defensive. And so we sometimes think that containment was a purely defensive strategy, that it just kind of involved hanging back and waiting for the Soviet Union to collapse. George Kennan, who's often regarded as the author of containment, was at pains to say that that was not true during the late 1940s, that containment had an offensive component as well. And indeed, during the Cold War, the United States did a number of things to try to throw the Soviet Union off balance, to keep it from hitting its stride in international affairs. These efforts ranged from training and then parachuting paramilitaries into places like Albania and Ukraine during the early Cold War in hopes that they could link up with violent resistant movements against communist regimes there. It included information warfare, using things like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty to broadcast into the Soviet bloc, even into the Soviet Union itself, in the hopes of introducing alternative sources of information there. During the 1980s, it involved supporting anti-communist insurgents in places like Nicaragua and Afghanistan. Some of these things worked very, very well. I would put Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty in that category. Some of them did not work at all. Many of the individuals in the United States tried to parachute back into the Soviet bloc in the 1940s and 1950s to make life difficult for the Soviets, ended up getting captured or killed, unfortunately. But all of these things had the purpose of imposing costs on the Soviet Union, of making it more difficult, of complementing a defense of Western positions with a selective offense against Soviet positions. U.S. officials did not intend to overthrow the regime in Moscow. They understood that that would be difficult to achieve and it would be dangerous to try. That was actually one of the things that certainly could lead to war between the United States and the Soviet Union. What they did intend to achieve was to raise the cost that the Soviet Union had to pay to compete with the United States and with the West, and to thereby make it harder for the Soviets, who were a weaker power after all, to stay in the competition over time. That's the model that's most relevant today, I think. The United States should not be seeking regime change in China or in Russia. I don't think it's within our power to bring that about anytime soon. I think it would be hugely destabilizing and could potentially lead to a pretty dangerous situation. For that matter, I'm not even sure that if there was a change of regime in China or Russia, that what resulted would be better for the United States as opposed to worse. What the United States should try to do is to replicate the Cold War experience of imposing costs on the other side and forcing them to play a little bit more defense and a little bit less offense. You're seeing a very good example of this in Ukraine right now. Ukraine is obviously fighting a war for its survival at the moment. The United States is helping it, and in the process, it is waging a pretty ruthless and brutally effective proxy war against Russia, against Vladimir Putin's regimes. The United States is delivering arms, it's providing intelligence, it's providing funding, which is helping Ukraine to bleed the Soviet army on Ukrainian soil and to impose sky-high costs on the aggressor. Russia is going to come out of this conflict much weaker than it was going in. And that's of advantage to the United States. There are other ways in which the United States can pursue this sort of strategy as well. There's more the United States can be doing, for instance, to disrupt the surveillance systems, the surveillance state that the Chinese Communist Party has built to keep tabs on its own population. There's more it can be doing to sanction Chinese officials and entities that are engaged in terrifying human rights violations in places like Xinjiang province. Some of these things will actually have the benefit of provoking an outsized Chinese response. And so I'll give you an example of this. In April 2021, the United States and a few dozen other democratic countries, mostly in Europe, also in places like Australia and Canada, imposed some fairly symbolic sanctions on a number of Chinese officials who had been involved in the repression of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. There was nothing particularly special about these sanctions. But the issue was so sensitive for China that China totally overreacted in response, launching its own sanctions against dozens of European officials, going after think tanks and newspapers in places like Australia and Germany, and so compromising its own interests that the Europeans actually walked away from an agreement on investment and trade that they had signed with China just a few months earlier. So this is the sort of bait and bleed strategy that you can use to force an opponent to over-respond when you hit it in a sensitive place. All of this, of course, is a recipe for some degree of diplomatic tension in the relationship. I think it's also a recipe for being effective in long-term rivalries with Russia and China. Now, the last thing I'll say is that I realize that none of this sounds like a great deal of fun. What I'm talking about, obviously, is a future of high tensions. It's a future of higher geopolitical danger than the United States has had to deal with since the end of the US-Soviet Cold War. In some ways, it's a relatively ugly path ahead. I do think, though, that that's somewhat unavoidable, and it brings me to my final lesson, which is that there are worse things than having to wage a Cold War. And if you think back to the strategy that the United States pursued during the Cold War, it was often called containment. No one thought that this was a particularly brilliant strategy. Containment was slow, it was plodding, it required an enormous amount of patience on the part of the United States. It also required a willingness to hazard confrontations with the Soviet Union over places like Korea or Berlin or Cuba. It seemed to combine perpetual danger with perpetual indecision. And so it shouldn't surprise us at all that containment was actually heavily criticized from the time that the Truman administration came up with it in the late 1940s. It was the subject of criticism from the progressive left, from people like Henry Wallace, Franklin Roosevelt's former vice president, who ran on an anti-containment platform in 1948. It was the source of criticism on the center left, from people like the famous journalist Walter Lippmann, who warned that containment was a strategic monstrosity that could not possibly succeed. It was criticized by the mainstream right, by people like John Foster Dulles, who argued that it was an amoral and reactive policy that would not work in the 1952 election campaign, and of course by the old isolationist right, by people like Senator Robert Taft from Ohio. And all of these critics made a variety of arguments about containment. They said that it was a formula that would exhaust the United States over time, that would deplete American resources, that would lead the United States to make terrible mistakes, either in its own domestic politics or in third world countries. And in a lot of these cases, they actually weren't wrong. A lot of these consequences did eventuate during the Cold War. And yet, nonetheless, the United States stuck with containment over a 40-plus year period, not because it was an extremely attractive strategy, but because it was simply the best of the bad alternatives. Containment was designed as an alternative to the diplomatic appeasement that had helped to bring on World War II. It was also designed as an alternative to the sort of military escalation that could lead to World War III, which in a nuclear age would be absolutely catastrophic. The point of containment was to walk a relatively narrow path between dangerous and even repugnant alternatives, and it succeeded beyond anyone's expectations in doing so. So today, nobody wants a new Cold War, and that's understandable because we remember, at least we understand how awful the old Cold War was. But what we're seeing today is that there is such a thing as evil in the world, that there are really nasty autocracies out there that are trying to advance their own vision of international order, and that the alternative to deterring war, whether in Ukraine or in Eastern Europe or in the Taiwan Strait, may eventually be having to fight it. And I think above all, we're seeing that the alternative to waging Cold Wars against China and Russia is seeing them consign the world order that the United States and its allies achieved through their victory in the Cold War to history. And I think that would lead the world to a pretty dark place. And so waging a new Cold War is not a pretty picture, but I think it's a way of avoiding a future that is uglier still. So I will stop there. I appreciate your time and attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Carl. So we have questions. We'll start with questions. I just want to say that 2 o'clock sharp, we're going to stop because our speaker have flight to catch, and I also have to go somewhere. So, all right. What was the comment? Hold on.
First of all, thank you very much. It was excellent presentation, gave us an inside information. Few of us here in the audience grew up during the Cold War in the Soviet Union. So a lot of things you've talked about, we experienced that firsthand being in middle school and high school and on and on and on. Voice of America, Free Europe. It was the only source of information we can get what's going on in the world. At that time, everything going in the West was so attractive to the Soviet population that we looked into it with open mouth and open eyes and heartbeat. I live in the United States now for 44 years. What is going on right now is not very pleasant, and a lot of things are easily exchanged as a conversation over a cup of coffee, like a nuclear exchange. And Russia is being looked at as #1 enemy, though China overlooked and allowed to step onto the US soil, invest in the farmland, invest in the manufacturing and everything else. So what is your personal opinion of what's going on in the United States right now? Should we be very optimistic and have a heartbeat in a good way about what's going on? Because honestly, that is not how most of us see it.
Yeah. Thank you for the question and the perspective. So I will say that the good thing about being a historian is that you realize the present is never quite as bad as you think, because the past was never quite as good as we remember it. And so I don't mean to make light of the domestic challenges that the United States faces today. There's clearly a great deal of political division in the country, and in some ways that's quite worrying, and I'm sure we could all add to that our own list of the things that we worry about with respect to the future of the United States. That said, I'm not convinced that America's domestic problems today are worse than they were in, let's say, the late 1960s and early 1970s, right? When major urban centers were literally on fire, right, as a result of protests and urban unrest. In 1969, 1970, there were about 700 bombings per year in the United States. You can wind the clock back further. You can look at the early 1950s, McCarthyism, some of the very unattractive things about the United States during that period. You basically pick whatever period of American history you like, and my hunch is that when we look in detail at that history, we realize the United States actually faced very, very severe problems during that time as well. The history of the United States is one in which the country continually faces grave problems domestically, and its political system manages to work just well enough to overcome them for the most part. One of the interesting things about the Cold War, though, is it reminds us that the presence of foreign problems can actually help convince us to get our act together domestically. And so during the Cold War, one of the reasons that the federal government finally decides to get serious about promoting desegregation in the South is that it has simply become too embarrassing for the United States on the global stage to say that we are the champion of freedom in the world and to have essentially state-sponsored segregation persisting in a large part of the United States. One of the reasons that the United States has still the world's best university system is because of the investments that the US government made during World War II and during the Cold War in our universities as a way of making the United States more economically, intellectually, scientifically competitive with the other side. And so the question we should ask ourselves today is there a way in which facing up to the challenges we face from Russia or China can actually make us better suited to addressing some of our problems at home? And I think there's some limited evidence to suggest that may actually be the case. And so if you look at the CHIPS bill that went through Congress in the last session, that was a measure that, at least at the outset, enjoyed bipartisan support for investments, essentially in the US semiconductor industry and a variety of other things. That's an area where the United States presumably should want to be competitive in the first place, but it was the fear of being overtaken by China that motivated those investments. And so people may have different perspectives on that bill, but it's simply an example of the sort of dynamic that I'm talking about. And I'm hopeful that having sort of this challenge from abroad will help the United States deal with some of its internal problems. The last point I'll mention, though, is that the question isn't always, is the United States a perfect society? It's how does it stack up to the alternatives? And it's really remarkable. If you look at Chinese elites, high-ranking members of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping himself, where do they send their kids to college? They send their kids to college in the United States, sometimes under assumed names. And so that should remind us that, however well acquainted we are with the pathologies of our own country, it still looks pretty attractive to a lot of people overseas, including some of our rivals.
It seems to me that an important difference from the previous Cold War is that now we've got a bunch of rogue nations that either have or seeking nuclear capability, obviously North Korea, Iran, you could name a few others. How does that affect the analysis and the dynamic?
So it doesn't help, but one just historical point I'll make is that in some ways the United States actually did face a similar challenge during the Cold War. And so when we thought about rogue states during the Cold War, we didn't use that term, but we actually had in mind a country that was far more radical, far more dangerous, and far more powerful than any of the rogue states the United States confronts today, which was communist China. And so in the late 1950s and 1960s, Americans were in many ways more worried about communist China than they were about the Soviet Union. Communist China under Mao was one of the most radical countries in the world. The United States had fought 2 undeclared wars with China in Korea and Vietnam. There were a series of nuclear crises involving China in the 1950s. And one of the reasons that the United States and the Soviet Union got together in signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in the 1960s is that both of them were terrified as to what it would mean to have a China with nuclear weapons. So the dynamic is not entirely new, but I take your point, and I would say that in general, it just creates a messier international environment where the United States is going to find its attention pulled in multiple directions, even if it wants to focus on China, even if it wants to focus on Russia. And the example I would offer is this. Some point this year, in 2023, the United States is going to come to a pretty fundamental decision in its Iran policy, which is, do we basically acknowledge that Iran continues to enrich uranium, it continues to advance its nuclear program, and there's really nothing the United States can do to prevent it from becoming a nuclear threshold state, basically a country that can put together nuclear weapons pretty quickly? Or do we decide that we're going to use a higher level of coercion, economic coercion, covert coercion, maybe military coercion, to try to prevent Iran from doing this? You can argue that question either way. I don't have a particular view that I would offer you on that, although I'm happy to talk more about it. But the point I would make, though, is that's going to be happening as the United States is trying to figure out how to deal with the Chinese challenge in East Asia, as the war in Ukraine continues to rage, and that creates difficult dilemmas for the United States. And so I think it's just unrealistic for American officials to think that at some point the rest of the world is going to be quiet, and so we can really focus on the issues that we want to focus on. There's still a large world that's full of challenges that are important, even if they're not as severe as the ones posed by Russia and China, and so that's going to pose a complicating dynamic in our foreign policy in the years ahead.
It's hard to go after my friend. I wanted to just challenge you a little bit on the Ukraine thing, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. Seems to me that Putin and the oligarchs were doing a great job destroying Russia before this war started out. Russia's got an economy smaller than the economy of the state of Texas. They spent last year under $80 billion on military. If you add all of ours together, we spent close to $1 trillion, maybe a little bit more. Is it really something fundamental that we needed to do to break down Russia anymore? It seems to me they're a dying empire anyway. So I just wanted to challenge you a little bit from a libertarian standpoint.
Sure. So I think that let me make a couple points in response to this. I think it's a fantastic question. One point I'll make is just that whatever Russia's trajectory was before the war, it's dramatically worse now, right? Because the economy is so heavily sanctioned. Russia cannot legally access anyways, high-end semiconductors that use U.S. technology, and so it's going to be very much harder for Russia to reconstitute its military forces, to regenerate any sort of economic growth. There's been massive flight of private companies from Russia, in part due to the sanctions, in part due to moral concerns, and so on and so forth. And so, if you think that it's in the U.S. interest to degrade Russian power, and people may disagree on that, but I do, then the war has hastened that degradation. And so even in a military sense, Russian conventional forces are going to be dramatically weakened coming out of this war in a way that's going to take them years and years to reconstitute. I think that's good for the United States, although again, people may come at it with a different set of priors. But I think the real question kind of comes down to maybe what was implicit in your question, which is, how important, is Ukraine important enough to the United States to justify the level of intervention the United States has done to make it difficult for Russia to conquer the country? I would say yes, because I think that there's a very fundamental issue at stake here, which is whether we live in a world where it is allowed for big countries to not just invade but conquer smaller countries next door or not. We live in a pretty anomalous period in international history. Prior to 1945, countries were wiped off the face of the map all the time. It just doesn't happen much these days, and doesn't happen much these days because the most powerful country in the international system, the United States, has said, we don't want to live in a world where that happens. We've seen where that takes the world, and it's a bad place. So I would be willing to engage in a little bit of risk and cost in order to prevent Putin from overturning that norm. The other point I would make is that Ukraine is actually not a small country, right? Outside of Russia, it is geographically the largest country in Europe. A Ukraine that is controlled by Russia, and without the aid that the United States and other Western countries provided, Ukraine would have lost the war in relatively short order, and you would have a Russian puppet government in Kiev right now. That really remakes the landscape of Europe in a fairly fundamental way. It gives Russia much better options for exerting pressure on Poland and some of the Baltic states. It's going to create much greater insecurity up and down NATO's eastern front. My hunch is that it actually requires more investment from an American perspective over time to bolster NATO allies in that scenario than it does in the scenario that we're going to be looking at a couple of years from now. And then also there's the question of, if aggression succeeds in one place, does it incentivize aggression in another place? So for all of those reasons, I'm comfortable with the level of cost that the United States is bearing to support Ukraine. The level of aid we provided so far is about 5% of the US defense budget, and I think that's money well spent. But I recognize that there are serious debates about this, and I think those debates are likely to continue in the coming year as we continue to spend lots and lots of money and outlay lots and lots of military equipment to help the Ukrainian war effort.
Good afternoon. I have a question. It is my understanding that China is spending a lot of investment in Bangladesh, Latin America, Africa. May I know what is their long-term plan? As compared to US, I don't even know if we have a long-term plan. Thank you.
So with respect to the investments that you talked about, those things are often grouped together under the rubric of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? This is this Chinese geopolitical project that was unveiled about a decade ago. And the answer is that there are multiple things going on at once. And so some investments are simply efforts by Chinese firms, the Chinese state, to deal with overcapacity and overproduction at home. And so if you make too much cement or too much steel or something, you've got to export it. And infrastructure projects in Bangladesh or in Latin America or in Pakistan may be a way of doing it. But there is also more of a strategic intent there as well. And so part of what China is doing with projects like these is trying to develop overland transportation and supply networks that are not as vulnerable to being cut off by the US Navy if there's a conflict between the United States and China. And so some of the pipelines running through Central Asia, for instance, are a way to reach the Persian Gulf without having to go through the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca, for instance. China is using this as a way of developing political leverage in countries that it considers to be strategically important. So you mentioned Bangladesh, right? There are also BRI investments in Pakistan, elsewhere around the Indian Ocean basin. And when India looks at this, it sees an effort to encircle India, to build relationships with countries on India's frontiers, and thereby give China leverage in dealing with India. And so I think BRI is a lot of these things wrapped together. And I think the challenge for us, for the United States, is really to try to disaggregate it a little bit and to say, okay, what are the projects that are simply going to be black holes for Chinese money and effort over time? and what are the ones that are actually going to be strategically significant? Because some of these projects will add up to something that helps develop a port that China can then use as a naval base, something like that. That really matters. I find it hard to believe that China is going to get much strategic benefit out of sinking tens of billion dollars into infrastructure projects in Pakistan, for instance, though. I think that's likely to be a losing bet for them over time.
There were many religious wars in the past, like the Crusaders. Do we have a little bit of flavor of that kind of war now with Russia and Ukraine and the other countries around?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't know that I would call it a religious war, although obviously there have been interesting dynamics surrounding the role of the Russian Orthodox Church and Putin's regime and the disputes that's produced within Ukraine. I guess what I would say is that there is certainly an ideological component to these conflicts. So whether it's religious or not, Vladimir Putin, when he looks at Ukraine, he does not see an independent state, right? He sees an entity that historically, in his view, was an integral part of Russia and must be returned to Russia today. He really does seem something close to obsessed with the idea, in my view. I think there is an argument that you can make that what is fundamentally at issue in the war in Ukraine and in the competition with Russia and China more broadly is whether democratic or autocratic regimes are going to set the terms of world order in this century. And I think that's a fundamentally important question. So it's not the same as ideological conflicts were in the past, but there's certainly an ideological component to these issues today.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about religion war. Both countries, Russia and Ukraine, is Eastern Orthodox. So I don't really see any religious component to this at all, and more likely it's ideological. I have one more question, and it's going to be the last one.
Listen very carefully to the words that you used. And when you refer to George Kennan, you essentially said that he proposed the containment. If I remember correctly, he said two words. He said encirclement and containment. I don't know why you dropped the word encirclement, since, we have 800 plus military stations around the world. If that doesn't mean encirclement, I don't know what. That's one comment. Second comment is that you mentioned about the world power wars in the past, and you started with Sparta and Athens. I hoped that you were going to make reference to Thucydides's Peloponnesian War, where he wrote 7 tomes detailing that particular war. But what came out of it is the paradox, so-called, where an existing power will do its utmost to prevent from a nation power to overtake it. And this is the situation we have today in the world. And finally, a question. And the question is, I'll take what General Clausewitz said back in the 19th century. When you start a war, you better know how to end it. So my question to you is, now that we have a hybrid war with Russia and China, what do you think is the end? Or do we have any idea? Thank you.
All right, so let me try to address these quickly. The foremost author of the encirclement of Russia today is Vladimir Putin. It's not the United States. And so the reason I say this is that for years and years and years, Finland and Sweden stayed on the outside of NATO. Now they're trying to come in. It's not because of anything the United States did. It's because of something Russia did, right? Russia has generated the threat that makes them conclude that they'll be safer allying with the United States than not being allied with the United States. And I think that's the fundamental driver of the encirclement that both Russia and China are increasingly going to face in the future. In terms of kind of the how does this end, I think that's the fundamental question. And I don't think that the United States has answered that question, right? Our answer right now is that we're simply trying to strengthen the international system around China so that China cannot disrupt it. And we're trying to ensure that Russia does not achieve its aims in Ukraine. But I don't think US policymakers have figured out what they want a US relationship with Russia to look like after the war in Ukraine. I don't think US policymakers have figured out what it would take for the United States and China to come to a fundamentally improved strategic relationship. And I think that's one of the ways in which our understanding of the strategic competitions we're in today is actually not as impressive as what it was back in the late 1940s, where the United States answered these questions in relatively short order.
Thank you, Hal. And some of these questions would relate predicting the future, and I think in your line of work, crystal ball would be a perfect
Excellent.
gift for you to try to do this in the future.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, John.